Hello and welcome to the JSA studio. I'm your host, as always, Nathan, and today we are going to be talking about the Detroit Lions preseason game. We're going to recap the offense and the defense. We're going to get into some position battles and pick a player of the game. But before we do that, I'm real quick going to jump to college, as over this weekend it was announced that Jim Harbaugh would not be suspended for any games this season, as the NCAA rejected the University of Michigan's settlement offer for Jim Harbaugh to be suspended 4 games in this upcoming season, meaning that it will instead be bounced to the 2024 season if he were to get suspended. There have been some elements of the Michigan fan base that believe this could be a sign to Jim Harbaugh leaving the program. I don't think he's going to leave the program in general. I think he would have left by now if he wanted to leave. I think he's going to stay at the University of Michigan until he becomes probably the athletic director when he decides to retire from coaching. And this battle being drawn out is only going to be more good PR for Jim Harbaugh. He already appears to be the victim of what is most likely, in my opinion, a targeted attack by the NCAA. Not necessarily that they were looking at him more closely than other coaches to try and get him, but he probably slipped up on a few minor infractions and then they found something a little bit more serious, and now they're throwing the book at him instead of giving him the sweetheart deal that they give to a lot of other coaches and programs. I talk about that a little bit more in depth in my video on the topic, where I talk about how it's most likely more of a Jim Harbaugh thing than a University of Michigan thing. So if you want my thoughts on that, you can watch that video. As far as what this changes, well, once again, we're going to be heading into a off-season recruiting schedule with a bunch of shit hanging over Jim Harbaugh's head. I don't think it's going to help recruiting very much, but I think that's likely to be the biggest impact on the program. I don't think Jim Harbaugh is going to get suspended for more than 6 games. I don't think it'll be a season-long thing. Even if it was a suspension for longer than that, it would almost certainly go to actual U.S. court and be brought down to probably a 4 or 6 game sentence anyway. In their statement, the NCAA said that this wasn't about cheeseburgers, as people have been calling it Cheeseburger Gate or Burger Gate or whatever the hashtag was, I don't remember. Which, again, if you watched my video on the topic, I kind of already said that it likely wasn't about that. It was probably more having to do with the fact that Jim Harbaugh, since he came back to college football in 2015, has just been throwing haymakers at the NCAA, and they're like, this is how we're going to get him back now. I do think it is vindictive, and it's not necessarily targeted, but I do think they're like, oh, we got him on something, so we're going to throw the book at him and bring the hammer down. I think that's what the situation is. It's good that it won't affect this season, because next year, even if Jim Harbaugh is gone for half the year, next year is going to be a rebuilding year anyway. So you can kind of just take the hits that year and then get back going in 2025. With all that being said, let's go ahead and jump into the Lions now and start off with just talking about, in general, the offense and what stood out to me. I'm going to work my way from the top down here on the screen, starting off with Nate Sudfeld. Now, I do think there's a little bit more nuance to him and how he played than some people want to admit. He was okay. I don't think he was bad. That first interception was not on him. He got hit right as he let the ball go. That's going to be an interception if it was Patrick Mahomes, if it was Josh Allen, if it was Jared Goff, if it was anybody. It was just bad luck on the first play of the game. Outside of that, he made some reads, threw the ball a little bit, ran around a little bit to make some plays. But the second interception was where it went bad. That was just a bad pass. He just flat out missed the receiver over the middle. It wasn't even a good decision to throw that ball there anyway. So that play was his worst play of the game. Arguably his best play of the game, Jameson Williams let him down. That play would not have been a touchdown because the corner was right there. He would have been tackled inside the 5, but it would have been like a 40-yard gain, and Jameson Williams would have had a big play if he caught it, and Nate Sudfeld would have bounced back admirably from his previous interception. Also, Sudfeld was not getting a whole lot of help from his offensive line. It was okay at times, but there were a lot of liabilities on the field throughout the entire game. Matt Nelson got beat several times. Obina Eze got beat several times as well. And Pierce Baker also did not particularly play well as a center. The offensive line in general, outside of, I would say, probably only Coyote Alshika and maybe Jermaine Ifedi. Also, Sorsdal didn't do horribly in this game. There are definitely some areas that he needs to improve, but the offensive line in general was a letdown. Now, what wasn't a letdown was the receiving core. The receiving core, I thought, looked pretty good throughout the whole game. I thought Green looked good. I thought Coda looked good. Drummond, who, we were hearing all these good things about Drummond from training camp. I was expecting him to do more, maybe, but he was still okay. He ran some good routes every now and then, but he didn't impress like I wanted him to impress. I would say he's firmly below both Green and Coda in terms of potentially making the roster. Jahmyr Gibbs also had like an 18-yard gain on a scramble and check down sort of situation, so that was pretty good. But the guy who really impressed me more than Coda, who according to PFF was our best offensive player, the guy who really impressed me was James Mitchell. I think James Mitchell, heading into this year, was a bit of a bubble guy, but I think he potentially has tight end 3 pretty locked down. I really like James Mitchell's upside still. I think he could be a very effective either big slot or, an H or a move tight end. So I was very encouraged by what I saw out of him this game. Last thing I want to talk about here in just the general offensive section is the running backs, when it came to running the ball, left quite a bit to be desired, but they also didn't have a whole lot to work with in terms of solid play along the offensive line. Snell was probably the best of the group, but I don't think he makes the roster still because he just doesn't have any special teams upside like Reynolds or Ibrahim has as well. So I still think he's probably on the outside looking in the running back group at least. Moving on to the defense, a few players really stood out in this game. In the defensive backfield, that was mainly, to me, Starling Thomas and Tay Haynes. I thought they both played very well. As far as disappointing in the secondary, Chase Lucas and Will Harris did not have their best games. They both got beat several times, so you don't like to see that. But moving on to the defensive line, it honestly really impressed me. Just about everybody who wasn't Brock Martin or Corey Duran impressed me a whole lot in this game. Brock Martin was okay, but Duran was bad, really. Not that big of a deal, in my opinion, though. I think they're both potentially practice squad candidates, at least early on in the year. But Julian Okwara, Romeo Okwara, John Kaminsky, James Houston, Benito Jones, Isaiah Buggs, they were all really good, I think. And Levi Onwuzurike was potentially the best player on the field the entire game this past week. He was tremendously impressive. Now, it was preseason, and you can't take anything away from the preseason, but it was super nice to see him playing football and doing well. All of the linebackers, to me, were various levels of impressive. We'll talk about Jack Campbell a little bit more in the linebacker section of this video, but he was tremendous in this game. Derek Barnes, I feel like got lost in the shuffle as well because Jalen Reeves-Maben made some really good plays, a couple of splash plays, as well as Malcolm Rodriguez doing pretty well. And Nowasaki looked really good in the run game, struggled a whole lot in pass coverage, but in the run game, he looked solid. He is a potential practice squad guy as well. But to me, the guy who needs to be worried the most is Anthony Pittman. He looked slow and not very effective this game. I get that he's mainly a special teams player and that's going to be his value, but there are players that have actual on-the-field upside that also are great special teams players like Malcolm Rodriguez or Jalen Reeves-Maybin. So again, we'll talk about that a little bit more in the linebacker section of this video, but I would be concerned if I was him. So how does the quarterback room look right now? This is the way that I see it. The quarterbacks that are almost certainly going to make the roster are Goff and Bridgewater. Last year, the Lions did only carry 2 QBs on the actual active roster. They did have a practice squad quarterback as well. So there are really only 2 spots available for these players. I'm going to go ahead and put Studfeld on the bubble. I'm not sure he would go to the practice squad. I'm not sure he would get through waivers, or even if he did, there could potentially be a team that would be wanting him on their active roster to be their backup or just their third string quarterback on the active roster. So I'm not sure if he gets cut, he would be back with this team. As far as practice squad / the PUP list, Hendon Hooker is going to start the year on the PUP list, and Adrian Martinez, I think, is a very strong candidate to go to the practice squad as a protected player. Bridgewater coming in makes this a tremendous group. Jared Goff, I think, is going to be good, potentially even better than he was last year. Teddy Bridgewater, if Goff goes down, I don't think the season is sunk. I do think our ceiling goes for potentially battling to go to the NFC Championship game, to probably just making the playoffs if we win the division, but I don't think losing Goff will sink our season now that we have Bridgewater. It really was a shame that Hooker was hurt, because I really would have liked to seen him play in these preseason games, but that's not in the cards this year, maybe next year. As far as running backs go, this is the way that I see it right now. I think Montgomery and Gibbs are obviously in. Cabinda is likely to be the fullback. I think he makes the roster outright. And I think it's really Reynolds and Ozigbo, in my opinion, that are battling for that RB3/4, depending upon if you lump Cabinda into that group or if you just keep him as a fullback. Snell and Jefferson I'm putting as practice squad candidates, because I don't believe either of those guys give you really any special teams upside at all. I think Ozigbo, if he loses the bubble battle to Reynolds, which I think is very likely because Reynolds was a core special teams player for this team last year, he probably then becomes the practice squad running back. So I'm not sure either Jefferson or Snell can make the roster unless they really do something in these next 2 preseason games. Last year, the Lions only carried 4 running backs on their roster. However, that was with Cabinda on the PUP list to start the year. So I think he likely replaces one of them, and then it's really only 3 running backs on the roster. That's just my opinion. He could potentially take a spot from a tight end, because the Lions did have 4 tight ends on the active roster last year, but one of them was probably the replacement for Cabinda. But with there being so much depth at other positions on this team, I think it's very likely they just stick to 4 running backs / fullbacks and 3 tight ends, because they can use that extra spot for another position. So there were only 4 tight ends that got snaps last week, and we only have 4 listed on the roster. So I think this position is pretty set. I think Wright and Laporta are going to be the starters and also the guys that just play in a lot of 12 personnel, with Mitchell kind of being a specific sub-package guy, or if we're going all out on passing. Helm is firmly on the bubble. I don't think it's very likely he makes the team. Could be a practice squad candidate, potentially, but I'm not sure if they're going to use a practice squad spot on a tight end this year. So instead of doing a more detailed breakdown of who's going to make the roster or who isn't, I'm just going to use this time to talk about Sam Laporta. Sam Laporta had a little bit of a rough game. Now, he had that one drop. I'm not that concerned about it. Receivers drop the ball when they transition to the NFL. It happens to basically everybody. I mean, Christian Watson struggled with it last year. Jamar Chase struggled with it when he first got in the NFL. Travis Kelce had drop issues at the tight end position when he first transitioned to the NFL. So that's not that big of a deal to me. In the run game, as far as run blocking goes, he was okay. You know, he had a couple of coachable moments, is what I would say. Let a guy get his hands inside of him on one play when they were blocking, which didn't really let him move the defender like he wanted to or needed to for the play to work as intended. So he'll get better at that, by the way. That's not anything that I'm concerned with either. I'm not sure he's ever going to be like a really, really good run blocking tight end like Rob Gronkowski was, but I do think he's going to be a really, really good receiving tight end when he can get his confidence up and start making some of the catches that we know he's capable of making. And he's going to be able to make plays with the ball in his hand as well, which is very rare for the tight end position. So I still think he's going to be a very good tight end for a long time in the NFL. This preseason game did not change my opinion on that. Wide receivers are up next, and there is some serious depth in this group right here. I think the three players that are in are St. Brown, Jameson Williams, and Khalif Raymond, with the two depth options being Jones and Reynolds, with bubble players being Benson and Alexander. The reason I'm putting Trinity Benson in the bubble section of this video is because I do not think he is a practice squad candidate for the Detroit Lions like he was last year. I think they would, at this point, just move on from him. And as far as Maurice Alexander goes, he does have a chance to make the roster as the punt returner, because there is a scenario where early on in the year, Khalif Raymond is too valuable as a wide receiver to risk having him be the returner on kickoffs and punts. So that could be Alexander's way onto the roster. I do not believe he would get through waivers or make it onto the practice squad, even if he did get through waivers. If he were to be cut from the Detroit Lions, I think he's too good of a returner to not be on an active NFL roster returning punts or kicks. Then there's a serious battle for who's going to be the practice squad wide receivers. I think the leaders right now are Coda and Green. I'm not sure Drummond would be a practice squad kind of guy. I think he might have to go to a different team, and then maybe the Lions try to sign him back so he could be on the preseason team next year. I don't know, but I do think Green and Coda are firmly ahead of him, and maybe if they want to carry three practice squad wide receivers, Alexander potentially, if nobody decides that they want him as a punt returner, or if the Lions make him a protected practice squad player, or even Trinity Benson for some reason if they wanted him to be on the practice squad. I think all of them would make the practice squad over Drummond. But top to bottom, this is one of the better wide receiver rooms in the NFL. The only thing that you can say that they're really lacking is like a true jump ball kind of guy. Marvin Jones used to be that early on in his career. He's much older now. He's much slower now. I'm not particularly sure what his role is going to be, but he could be just a possession receiver running, short routes, not really getting down the field so much. Possession receiver kind of guy. Maybe even just a red zone player that they could throw the ball up to on a fade or something like that. I think that's potentially Marvin Jones's role on this team. Reynolds is likely to be the big slot option. He did also play some X and Z last year, but he's likely to be a bigger slot kind of situation if they want to do something funky with St. Brown or put him outside, or St. Brown is just getting a rest. Jameson Williams is going to start the year on the suspended list, but I think Raymond go ahead and just steps into that starting Z wide receiver role, that deep threat kind of guy. That's what he was last year when Williams wasn't healthy anyway. And then he was playing so good that Williams really didn't step in and get to have that big role that he was probably expecting, because Raymond was playing really well towards the end of the season. So I think Raymond, Williams, and St. Brown, when Williams comes off of the restricted list, that could be the starting three wide receivers, with Jones and Reynolds coming in to provide some size and some potential jump ball, possession receiver, catch in traffic kind of play. Moving on to the offensive line, I think there are 6 players that we know are going to make the roster. That's Decker, Sewell, Jackson, Vitae, Ragnow, and Glasgow. And there are 2 players who are vets and have kind of been around for a minute, and they're likely just to make the roster, as well as the key depth options, that being Afedi and Alshika. And that brings us to 8. Last year, the Lions carried 9 offensive linemen. I think they're very likely to do that again, which means that all of these players at the bottom of the screen are fighting for potentially 1 spot. Now, I think it's fairly likely it could go to either Galvin or Nelson as just a tackle. Usually, you only want 2 backup guards and 2 tackles, and maybe a guard center flexibility like Glasgow that could potentially save you a roster spot if you really need it. But what you really want is 2 guards and 2 tackles to be your depth on the offensive line. So we have the 1 backup guard in Glasgow and the other in Alshika, and only 1 backup tackle with Fetty. So the last spot is likely to be a tackle. It could end up being Sorsdal, and they've only got the 1 backup tackle, and maybe in an emergency scenario, Sorsdal could come in. He played tackle in college, so maybe he could potentially do it, or Vitae could potentially do it in an emergency situation. So they do have a little bit of flexibility along that offensive line as well. Pierce Blocker and Hart and Cecil are likely just to be cut in my mind. I don't think they're going to be involved in this team past the preseason. Maybe they can get jobs somewhere else on practice squads or whatever, but those are the guys that I think they're firmly on the bubble, and I'm not sure that the Lions would use practice squad spots on them. Eze and Sorsdal, I think, are likely to be practice squad candidates. Sorsdal could end up being that 9th offensive lineman like I talked about earlier, but I think he's more likely to just stay at guard and be on the practice squad for this year. The defensive line. This is where it gets difficult for me in terms of who's going to make the roster, who isn't going to make the roster, and how many players are they going to keep. Last year they kept 10, 5 interior and 5 exterior guys. So 5 D tackles and 5 defensive ends. I think there are 5 players safely on this team, and that's Aiden Hutchinson, Charles Harris, Liam McNeil, Isaiah Buggs, and John Kaminsky. There are then 5 more players that I think are very likely to make the team outright as key rotational pieces. And that's Brock Martin, Benito Jones, Levi Onwuzurike, Josh Pascal, and Romeo Okwara, with bubble guys being Chris Smith, Covington, and Julian Okwara. For those of you wondering where James Houston is, he's with the linebackers. I think he's more of a linebacker at this point, and he needs to be considered more of a linebacker at this point if he's going to make the team, and I want him to make the team. The only guy in terms of being actually just for the practice squad and only being the practice squad to me is Duran. I think he's the only guy on this list that is like that, even though I do think Brock Martin should be a candidate for the practice squad. You don't draft somebody in the 3rd round and then have them not make the roster. So that's just unlikely for me, even though I think he's the 4th, maybe even 5th best nose tackle on this team right now. There's a very real chance that the Lions could carry 11 defensive linemen here. I think they could potentially look to cut out different positions. Maybe they only go with 4 linebackers instead of 5. That's a possibility. They could take 1 less defensive back because they have so many versatile pieces that you really don't need a backup slot option if Branch gets hurt. So you could just kick Gardner Johnson down into that role or kick Sutton in from his role to play the nickel. So you could potentially save a roster spot there. But I don't think that's very likely. I think it's probably just going to be 10 guys, and that edge rusher rotation is going to be very, very good. But what would I like to see out of this group? Because the fact of the matter is, I think there's an opportunity here to pick up maybe a pick or 2, or potentially a pick swap by using someone like Romeo Okwara or Julian Okwara to get like a draft pick. Like maybe you swap a 7th round pick for a 5th round pick and send Julian Okwara to somebody. I think the Lions have that kind of depth on this team and on that defensive line. And I would really like Brad Holmes to do that, to trade one of these bubble roster guys on this team that would maybe be competing even for a starting spot or like the first guy off the bench position on other teams in the NFL. As much as I don't want to see some of these guys go, like, Benito Jones or Julian Okwara or Romeo Okwara, I don't want to see them leave. I like them. I like them a lot. I think they're high quality rotation and, probably middle of the pack starters in the NFL at their respective positions. But they're really not going to get the opportunity here because the Lions have so many good options along the defensive line. So I don't want to see them leave, but they're likely to leave. Linebackers are up next. And again, this one is really tough because there's a good amount of depth on this team right now. Like, we know Campbell, Anzalone, and I think Rodriguez are likely on this team. I think Malcolm Rodriguez is safely on this team, even though he was competing late in the game. I think that was because they want to see him versus Reeves-Maybin for that will linebacker position. But I think either way, if he ends up in that starting role or if it goes to Reeves-Maybin, I think he's on the team. And then I think Barnes and Jalen Reeves-Maybin are going to make this team as the 4th and 5th linebackers and special teams aces. I think Barnes can play the Sam or the Mike position if something were to happen to Campbell or Anzalone. And I think Jalen Reeves-Maybin could play the will or potentially the Mike position as well. And then bubble guys, the Lions could keep 6 linebackers. It's not an impossibility. I do think it's unlikely, but it's not an impossibility. And that's Anthony Pittman and James Houston are the guys that are going to be competing for that spot, with the practice squad guy being Trevor Nowaski, who impressed me quite a bit during this game. I thought he found the lanes in the run game that linebackers need to find. I thought he found that very well and very naturally. He did struggle quite a bit in the pass game, but almost all young linebackers do that. So I'm not concerned about it. I think he's a prime candidate for the practice squad. I'm going to go back up here to Jack Campbell, though. Obviously, he was a top 20 pick. I think it was a little bit of a reach, but he looked so much better in this game than he did in college. Kelvin Shepherd has done a phenomenal job with him because in college, I saw him run into blocks that he didn't need to run into. I saw him overrun plays pretty consistently. It was like almost 1/3 of all of his run snaps. He was either running into a block that he didn't need to run into or overrunning the play. It was a major problem for him. We did still see him overrun a couple of plays as well this game, but his athleticism allowed him to get back into it, and also just the poor play of the offensive lines that he was going up against in this game allowed him to just still be making plays. I do think that is going to become more of a problem in the regular season when you're playing starting offensive linemen. I think you could then see a backside blocker come and seal him off because he overran the play. That is still something he's going to have to work on. But I didn't see really at all him running into blocks that he didn't need to take. Like, there was one play where he just read it immediately that it was going to be a run play, goes up, meets the guard like 1 yard downfield, sheds him, and then goes and makes a tackle. That stuff like that, you just saw that on film quite a bit at Iowa as well. But that needs to be done more consistently for me to feel comfortable with him being the full-time starter, which he's likely to be anyway. But it is going to be a work in progress with him. He was really good in dropping. He had that one play in man coverage where he was guarding the running back. They actually credited him with a pass breakup because the ball hit his calf, which is kind of funny. But he looked good in coverage even outside of that play. He only had a handful, like 6 maybe, drops into coverage this game, but he looked natural moving, which is something we saw on film beforehand. And the length is going to help him be effective in coverage as well in zone drops. So he played well. He looked much improved, probably from the film in college to the NFL. He is the guy on this team that has improved the most out of all of these rookies, at least the ones that I've seen so far. So who do I think is not going to make the roster? I think, honestly, right now, the player with the smallest chance of making the roster is James Houston. I think they're only going to keep one of James Houston or Julian Okwara, and worst case scenario, they don't keep either of them, which is a real scenario. I think it's like 25% chance they don't keep either of them, 50% chance they keep one of them, and then like a 25% chance they somehow manage to keep both of them. But if I had to guess, I think the 5 linebackers are going to be Campbell, Anzalone Rodriguez, Barnes, and Jalen Reeves-Maybin. I don't want to see Houston leave because there is no chance he makes it through waivers. So he won't even get to be a protected practice squad member because there's a 0% chance he makes it through waivers. Same thing with Julian Okwara. But this is where I would really like to see a trade as well. Maybe you can get another late round pick for Barnes, or really Barnes is probably the only guy that I would be comfortable trading, because I think a new scenery for him, the potential to have a consistent role and potentially even a starting role on another team would be good for him heading into free agency. This will be his 3rd season, actually, so he has one more year of roster control, and then he would be a free agent after that. But I do like Barnes a lot. I think if he was our starting linebacker, I wouldn't be mad at all, but the linebacker and defensive line depth on this team is absurd. Best case scenario, for me, 10 defensive linemen, 6 linebackers, and you keep Houston as part of the linebacker core, because I don't think he makes it through the waiver wire. I think that would probably be, in terms of a realistic scenario, the best case scenario. Maybe you can trade Julian Okwara, maybe you can't, who knows. Maybe you cut somebody else that I don't think is going to get cut, like Romeo Okwara or Benito Jones, and then you keep both of them. I don't know. It's a possibility, but just, I'm looking at these numbers and I'm crunching the numbers, and I think James Houston is very likely right now to not make the roster in terms of the tough cuts. I think it's James Houston that might be on the block. DBs are up next. Last year, the Lions carried 11 defensive backs, 6 corners, and 5 safeties onto the active roster, or at least the initial active roster. I think they're fairly likely to do 10 or 11 again. I think you could get away with 10, 6 corners and 4 safeties in that scenario, because you have so much versatility in that safety room that you could probably get away with only keeping 4 safeties. So for the guys that I'm like almost 100% positive are going to make this team, that's Cameron Sutton, Brian Branch, Tracy Walker, Kirby Joseph, CJ Gardner-Johnson, and Emmanuel Mosley. But Mosley is currently on the PUP list. Don't know when he'll come back. I think if he's on the PUP list at the beginning of the season, he has to stay on there for 6 weeks. Or maybe it's 3 weeks. I'm not sure. There's also a chance that they could just put him on IR and then bring him back after 3 weeks as well. Or maybe he has to rest for a week and then do that differently. I'm not sure how all that semantics works, really. But that's 6 players, potentially 5 roster spots that are like taken off the table for everybody. So I'm just going to say Mosley is going to start the season on the PUP list. So that's only 5 spots. And then I have 3 other players that I'm pretty sure are going to make the roster. And that's Jerry Jacobs, Savion Smith, and Will Harris. I think all of those guys are, Jacobs is CB3 probably, and Smith is then likely a solid depth option and a core special teams player. Same thing with Will Harris, but with the safety group, or really he's probably the backup nickel in terms of like actual depth chart projection. He's probably the backup nickel, but he's a solid depth option, has experience playing all over the back end. He can play strong safety, he can play outside corner, he can play in the slot if you want him to. So I think he's pretty locked into a roster spot as well. And then you have the bubble players, and that's Lucas, Melanfonwu, Breeze, Thomas, and Hayes. Lucas did not have a good game in this past preseason, so he might be on the bottom half of this bubble with Tay Hayes and Starling Thomas in terms of actually making the roster. I think Melanfonwu, based off of the athleticism and the special teams upside, is closer to being on the depth chart than he is cut. And Breeze had a really good game this past week, so if he can keep doing that, then he's going to make the roster outright as probably safety 4. Smith and Jacobs, I think, are pretty locked in as corner 3 and 4. So when you're talking about 5 or potentially even cornerback 6, I think Starling Thomas and Tay Hayes are leading that group. I think there's a strong possibility one of those players makes the roster outright. And then Stephen Gilmore is also competing for that position as well. Stephen Gilmore played well on the outside this past week, as well as Hayes and Thomas. All three of them really played well this past week. And Brandon Joseph also had that interception at the end of the game. He had a decent game as well, but I think he's likely just a practice squad player for year 1. Maybe year 2 he can get onto the roster, play some special teams, and maybe some situation ball. But year 1, I think he's likely just a practice squad player. So how do I see this shaking down? I think there's a strong possibility we see 11 players on this team, but it's actually going to be flipped from last year. I think you might see 6 safeties and 5 corner at the beginning of the year, with a safety getting cut and Mosley coming back in as a corner when he gets off the PUP list. But I think you see those 8 spots plus Mosley on the PUP list. I think you see those. I think that's pretty solid. And then I think you could see Melanfonwu, Breeze, and if I had to guess, Starling Thomas fill out those last 3 roles to begin with. And then maybe Melanfonwu or Breeze get cut when Mosley comes back. Honorable mentions for my player of the game are going to go to Maurice Alexander for that punt return, and Brian Branch for the play of the game when he lit up Cole Beasley on that little flat route that he ran. You know, Alexander did have that drop on offense, which is what probably kept him from being the player of the game, in my opinion. And Brian Branch did get beat a couple of times by, the savvy vets with Jamison Crowder and Cole Beasley. So that's what keeping him from being the player of the game for this first preseason game. I do think Alexander has made a roster somewhere. It might not be here. I did kind of in the wide receiver section lay out the scenario where he makes the roster at the beginning of the season. But I think that punt return touchdown got him a job as a punt returner somewhere in the NFL. It might not be here. And Brian Branch obviously isn't going anywhere. He's our starting nickelback. But the player of the game for this first preseason week is Julian Okwara. I mean, he had 3 sacks. He won pretty much every pass rush set that he was in. He had constant pressure all over the place and was an all-around great performance for him. He is the player of the game for preseason week 1. And that is all that I have for you today. Go ahead and like the video if you liked it. Subscribe if you want to keep on seeing more content like this. I will be covering the Lions and Michigan football throughout the entire season. And if you disagreed with me at any point in the video, or if you just have something to say, go ahead and leave a comment down in the comment section below. But let's keep it civil. After all, what do I know? I'm just some asshole. And I'll see you next time.